Hello, everyone, and welcome. Our guest this evening is synonymous with what exemplifies the very best in the meteorological broadcasting field. Born in the Bronx, he received an undergraduate degree from the College University of Albany, SUNY. Graduate degrees were conferred from the University of Oklahoma and the City College of New York. Nominated for 8 Emmy Awards, in 2015, he was voted as the #1 weatherman by the Associated Press for New York State. For many years, we have all known him as our favorite go-to weatherman from Channel 12. He is a unique breed of forecaster in that he always took the time to explain various astronomical and meteorological occurrences to the public. Included among his already well-known talents are his interests in photography and his latest being that of a very proud grandfather. So won't you please join with me in welcoming the one and only Joerao.
Now the technical stuff comes where we bring up my, and I just hit the space bar.
The space bar.
It's fantastic. Isn't that wonderful? You know, many of you who know me, I'm a very sentimental guy, but you have no idea how humbling that introduction was to somebody, a big star like me. So today, or this evening, I'm talking about comets, the study and comets. And so naturally, for comets, we're going to kick off this talk by talking about baseball. Absolutely. Now, I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but since organized baseball, Major League Baseball began in 1869, there has been, as of the end of the World Series this year, 20,790 people who have played Major League Baseball, and 1,519 have played only one single game. The baseball players, just to get into the major leagues, of course, is very special, but Major League Baseball players, they come and they go. I'm sure that, you know, somebody who played baseball 30 years ago or 40 years ago, if I mentioned the name, you wouldn't know who it was. Each decade, each era has its own bunch of characters. For example, if I were to ask you to mention ball players who played in the decade of the 1950s, I'm sure that none of you would come up with Hoot Evers, Bob Brokowski, or George Wilson. However, there are great ball players, what we call five-tool ball players. These are ball players who could hit for power, field, throw, run. These are the great ones. These are the ones that everybody remembers. And in the 1950s, for example, we all remember Willie, Mickey, and the Duke. These were the top ball players, or among the top ball players in the 1950s. And in fact, so great were they that they made it into baseball's Hall of Fame. Well, that's looking at it from a baseball perspective. Now, in terms of comets, well, I'm sure that you are well aware that there are comets, lots of comets. I'm sure, in fact, that since the 1800s, or over the last couple of hundred years, there have probably been many hundreds, maybe even thousands of comets that have come by. And in most cases, those comets are not really, I could set up my 10-inch Dobsonian telescope in the parking lot here. And if we stayed through the entire night through that telescope, I'd probably be able to find and show you at least 6 or 8 comets. But they certainly are not very impressive. Most comets don't look like anything more than balls of fuzz or hazy objects, maybe a slight tail, but no big deal. Kepler once said There are as many comets in the sky as there are fish in the sea. So comets really aren't all that special for the most part, except there are also great comets. And just like ball players, these are the comets that really stand out. And these are the comets that make a lot of news. A great comet, what is a great comet? A great comet is one that is set apart from all the other comets that appear in a specific year or even a specific decade as being stupendously bright or fantastically structured. Perhaps the tail stretches a third of the way across the sky. Perhaps the comet becomes so brilliant that it is visible with binoculars or small telescope or even with the naked eye during the daytime. That indeed is a great comet. They don't come along every year, of course. In fact, great comets on the average come along about once every 20 to 25 years. This talk tonight, we'll be talking about the great comets. But back first to our baseball analogy. You know, there are some baseball players that play in double or triple A, the farm teams, and you hear about them. The big club says he's doing very good. We think we're going to be bringing him up soon. And in some cases, it's like, well, come on, bring him up. He's hitting home runs left and right. He's got a 350 batting average in the minor leagues. He'll do great when he gets up to the Mets or the Yankees or whatever the big club happens to be. They bring him up, and what happens? They fall flat on their face. Some of you know the movie or probably watched the movie Moneyball with Brad Pitt. Brad Pitt played the role of a ball player who the New York Mets invested heavily in back in the 1980s. He was going to become the next superstar. And what happened? When he came up to the major leagues, he fell flat on his face, and he eventually became a general manager or somebody in charge of bringing other ball players up. But he was terrible. Same thing with comets. Same thing with comets. There are comets that as they are approaching the sun, they look like they're going to be fantastic. Some of you in this audience may be old timers and may remember the name Comet Kohoutek. Comet Kohoutek, which came around in 1973. The comet was discovered out near the orbit of Jupiter. And as it approached the sun, there were some astronomers who said, this could be great. This could be fantastic. This could be the comet of the century. That's what people called Comet Kohoutek. Comet Kohoutek was destined to be one of the great ones of all time. What happened? The comet got bright briefly when it rounded the sun, but as it moved out away from the sun, it faded very, very quickly. It was not the comet of the century. It barely made comet of the week. I remember Johnny Carson had Dr. Carl Sagan on The Tonight Show, and he asked Dr. Sagan about Comet Kohoutek, why did it do so badly? And Dr. Sagan said, well, you know, Comet Kohoutek was unusual. It's the only comet in history that ever came with a fuse on it. It was a bomb of unbelievable proportions. Well, in 1990 came another comet that had glory written all over it, and that was Austin, Comet Austin. And there you see the February edition of Sky and Telescope, and there in the upper left corner, monster comet coming. And what happened? The Leviathan turned out to be an earthworm. It turned out to be a very dismal failure. It didn't live up to expectations at all. It never got brighter than fifth magnitude, barely visible to the unaided eye. More recently, in 2013, you may remember Comet Ison. And Comet Ison was going to be a gloriously brilliant comet. It was going to come closest to the sun around Thanksgiving of 2013. I remember Bob Berman at NEAF that year doing a program and talking about Comet Ison. He said, this comet has glory written all over it. Well, the comet ended up disintegrating on the day when it was supposed to get bright, rounding the sun on Thanksgiving. Well, it had something all over it, but it certainly wasn't glory. And in fact, this comet turned out to be, if you'll pardon the expression, because it was Thanksgiving when it disappeared, a real turkey. It was not a great comet at all. But we're not going to talk about those comets. We're going to talk about the ones that did live up to expectations, the ones that did put on a fantastic show. And before I get into this, for those who are the uninitiated, two things. Number one, often in this talk, I'm going to mention the term perihelion. And those of you who are into astronomy, you know what that is. But for those who don't, perihelion is when a comet or any celestial object comes closest to the sun. And also magnitude. This is going to play an important role. Magnitude, astronomers use magnitude. The lower the number, the brighter the object. So the faintest object you can see with your unaided eye without a telescope or binoculars is magnitude 5 or 6. The North Star, Polaris, is about +2. As you lower the number, the object gets brighter. The brightest stars in the sky are 0 to +1 magnitude. And then when you start going into the negative range, that is when you get the brilliant or super bright objects. Jupiter, -2. Venus, -4. The moon, the full moon, -12. And the sun, for God's sake, -26. And some of these numbers I'm going to be bandying about in this talk tonight. Yes, there have been comets that have gotten to be exceedingly, exceedingly bright. So now we'll begin the talk tonight with, and by the way, I'm going to talk about great comets, but you know, there are some great comets that are greater than others. And in fact, in the last 450 years, there have been 4 super comets. We'll start off our talk tonight talking about one of them that appeared in the year 1577. As you can see here, if you know the constellations, you may take note of the fact that the constellations here look to be backwards or reversed, and that's because this is the way you see them on a celestial globe. And here is the path or the track of the great comet of 1577. It is perhaps the brightest intrinsically bright comet that has ever been observed. It was discovered in Peru in early November of 1577, shortly after having passed through perihelion. The distinguishing fact about this comet, according to the records, is that 1 week after perihelion, it could be seen in the twilight sky and was so bright that it shone through clouds like the moon, an incredible object indeed. 2 more weeks elapsed, and the famous astronomer Tycho Brahe accidentally and independently discovered the comet by seeing its reflection in his garden fish pond during early twilight. The comet was an incredibly brilliant object, brighter at that time than the planet Venus, and had a tail extending out 30 degrees from its head. 2 months following perihelion passage, the object was still of 0 magnitude, and it was last seen at the end of January of 1578. Indeed, a supercomet, one far beyond the general run of even great comets. Now, unfortunately, before the 17th century, comets were not rendered artistically with much reality. So we have some rather stylized drawings of comets. What you see on the screen now is a broadside, kind of a flyer, if you will, that was distributed throughout Europe in the year 1680, announcing the arrival of the Great Comet of 1680. Now, the Great Comet of 1680 made 2 close approaches to the Earth as it rounded the sun. On the way into the sun, it reached a magnitude of +2, about as bright as the star Polaris, and had a tail or an appendage that stretched for 20 degrees across the sky. But this was nothing compared to what was going to happen at and after perihelion. In fact, at perihelion mid-December of 1680, the comet head became so brilliant that it was visible to the unaided eye in the daytime within a few degrees of the sun from Albany, New York. At that time, the assumed magnitude was -6. An incredible object as a world within 146,000 miles of the solar surface and back down into the evening sky, it grew a tail that was 70 degrees long. During January of 1681, the comet was still 3rd magnitude and the tail still 55 degrees long. An absolutely stupendous object. And here is one of the very earliest factual renderings of the comet, the Great Comet of 1680. And for those of you who know the constellations, the star in which the tail of the comet is almost over is Altair. And the 2 flanking stars, we're looking at Aquila the Eagle, low in the evening sky, the western evening sky, in mid-December, late December of 1680. Another early rendering, this one possibly done from the New York Albany area, done by a Dutch painter, and the painter and the painting ended up in Holland, where it appears at this time. Now, it's not a purely accurate rendering. As you can see, the crescent moon is not facing in the proper direction relative to the sun, but one does get an idea of the stupendous object. Obviously, the tail here must have been a brilliant, brilliant thing in the late twilight. It must have been a fabulous comet indeed. Come 1744, we have another super comet. The Great Comet of 1744 was perhaps the grandest comet to appear in our skies in the last 1,000 years. This comet was second magnitude of discovery late in November of 1743. It became a brilliant naked eye object by January. Toward the end of January, the records indicate that it exceeded the brilliance of every star in the sky, apparently -2, and it was still weeks from perihelion passage. About mid-February, the comet's head had reached the brilliance of Venus, and as it passed through perihelion during the last week of February, situated 12 degrees from the sun in the daytime sky, it was visible to the unaided eye as an object of at least -5 or -6. But the greatest part of the display came after perihelion. As the comet whirled around the sun and reappeared in the morning sky, it produced this great celestial fan. 6 brilliant tails came up over the eastern horizon, the longest of which 45 degrees in length. At the time, the comet's head was still brighter than Jupiter is in our evening sky right now. The appendages, the numerous appendages shown here, were short-lived, and in fact they lasted no more than 2 weeks. But once they had all faded away, a single brilliant ray shot out from the comet's head and attained a length in the sky of 90 degrees. The next comet to come along bears a very interesting name and one that is most familiar to all of us amateur astronomers, for it was Comet Messier of 1769. It is sometimes known, though, as Napoleon's comet, because you see in later years, Napoleon considered this object to be his protecting genie, for it appeared at the time of his birth. And Messier, being a very politically savvy amateur and professional astronomer, wrote numerous articles and papers based on this and absolutely admitting it is no question a protecting genie for Napoleon. That way he probably retained his head if he was ever brought before the court of Mr. Napoleon long ago. I suspect that if Messier were alive today, he'd probably be a Republican. But nevertheless, anyways, this comet was an extraordinary object. It first appeared as a 4th magnitude object low in the morning sky. Initially, again, it was about 4th magnitude, but brightened up very rapidly. And on September the 10th, 1769, it reached its maximum. The head was very low in the morning sky, the eastern morning sky, and about 0 to -1 magnitude. But the most impressive thing about the comet was its 100-degree tail. The comet head at the time was located in Monoceros, the unicorn, to the east of Orion, but the terminus of the tail was located in western Cetus, crossing 7 hours of right ascension. The next comet to come along that was of considerable magnitude was the Great Comet of 1843. It is the third of the super comets to appear in the last 4 centuries. It is probably the parent object of the Kreutz sun-grazing comet group, which has produced many of the most brilliant comets in recorded history. At perihelion on February the 28th, 1843, this comet passed a mere 126,000 miles from the surface of the sun, and at that time became one of the brightest comets in all of history when it briefly attained a magnitude of -17. It was seen by countless observers in the daytime as a brilliant object only 1 or 2 degrees from the sun in the sky. And one French report indicated that it appeared as brilliant as the flow of fire from a smelting furnace. 2 weeks following the perihelion passage of this comet, it had moved too far south to be seen from the northern hemisphere, although it continued to be seen well to the south of the equator. But the comet did move northward thereafter, and initially only the tail stuck above the southwestern horizon, and raised a considerable controversy for a week or more because in Europe, they didn't know exactly what they were observing. Some people thought it was some strange atmospheric phenomenon. But once the head of the comet came above the southwestern horizon, there was no question that here was indeed the great comet of 1843 that had been seen in the daytime sky only a few weeks earlier. The tail grew very, very rapidly after perihelion and attained a length of 45 degrees within a few days of the middle of March. The maximum, however, came a week later when it reached 64 degrees. Now, the incredible thing about the great comet of 1843, in addition to the enormous brilliance, is the fact that the projection angle of the tail, as seen from the Earth, was considered to be very unfavorable. In other words, it was such that we were kind of looking more or less head on at it, and that should have foreshortened the length of the tail. And yet, the comet tail still managed to grow to 64 degrees in length. What did that translate to? In fact, the longest tail ever recorded, more than 200 million miles of actual length. If you place the head at the sun, the tail would have extended out beyond the orbit of the planet Mars. Amazing. Another wonderful comet of the 19th century was Donati's comet, which appeared in 1858. Considered as a classic comet by many because of its long curving tail, beautifully illustrated here. The comet was discovered in late August of 1858 and grew daily brighter. And as it grew more and more, and the tail became longer and more complex, it became a stunning object in the evening sky of mid and late October of 1858. This is a iconic rendering of the comet as it was seen over the Cathedral of Notre Dame in late October of 1858. Here you see the bright star right next to the comet head is Arcturus. In Boötes the herdsman. Here you see the semicircle of stars which marks Corona Borealis, the northern crown. The comet at one point became so bright that it was visible even during daytime through telescopes. But it was also heading rapidly south after mid-October, and by the end of October, it had gone too far south to be seen from our latitudes, from northern latitudes. Only 3 years elapsed between the appearance of Donati's comet and Tebbutt's great comet of 1861. Another comet of extraordinary brilliance, not intrinsically, but because the comet passed very, very close to the Earth. In fact, it was discovered in the southern sky in mid-June, moving rapidly northward. It quickly passed through solar conjunction and then appeared unannounced in the northern morning sky. Now, you got to remember, 160 years ago, astronomical communications were very, very slow. Today, of course, we can go on our smartphones or our iPhones or our PCs and connect directly to the IIU Minor Planet Center. And many times we can learn about a new discovery within just hours after the initial sighting. This was not so back in the mid-18th century, mid-19th century, I should say, when sometimes weeks would pass before discovery announcements would pass from one hemisphere over to the other. And this was the case of the great comet, Comet Tebbutt of 1861. So it was discovered in the southern sky in mid-June, moved northward, came into conjunction with the sun toward the end of June, and then suddenly, unexpectedly, emerged into the pre-dawn, early morning eastern sky. Now, when Comet Tebbutt made its first appearance for the northern hemisphere, it must have been an incredible object indeed, because contemporary records tell us that some observers initially mistook it for the rising moon. Others indicated the head and tail were capable of casting shadows. The only time in recorded history that a comet reportedly cast shadows. The comet had a tail, the breadth of the tail was approximately 60 degrees long. And on the night when the tail of the comet were nearest the Earth, at the very end of June, the tail stretched a prodigious 120 degrees across the sky. We were actually being bathed in the tail. You see, here is the comet, and here's one of the tails that extended out from it. Here is the Earth and the moon, and we were, again, looking literally within the tail, down toward the tail, toward the head of this comet. Truly an amazing object. As I said, the tail stretched across the sky for 120 degrees. The head was located near Beta Aurigui, which you see now here in this view. Beta Aurigae now in November is located low in the eastern sky, in the evening sky, and the tail stretched all the way out to, well, Ophiuchus, which is visible now in our western evening sky. On the next clear night, we had a lot of clouds out there this evening, but on the next clear night, the next clear evening, step outside and take a look of first the eastern sky where Beta Aurigae is, and then turn around and take a look where Ophiuchus is setting in the west. That's how long that tail was. An incredible, incredible sight indeed. The comet was moving directly away from the Earth and the Sun after the end of June, and so the tail diminished very, very quickly. It was 97 degrees long on July the 2nd, but then rapidly dwindled. 57 degrees on July the 8th, and only a mere 30 degrees on July the 12th. The comet was followed telescopically for more than a year. The last of the super comets came to us in the year 1882. It was the great September comet of that year. And it is perhaps the brightest comet other than 1843 that has ever been seen. It was a gigantic member of the Kreutz sun-grazing group, and as such, at perihelion, passed to within 264,000 miles of the solar surface. Northern Hemisphere observers had no warning of this comet, or, like some of the other comets, like the 1861 comet, it was discovered in the Southern Hemisphere and was not observable directly from the northern initially. But the biggest problem was that nobody bothered to send a telegram north that this comet was present, because it was already at discovery the brightest object in the sky other than the sun and the moon. Why send a telegram to your northern friends when all they need to do is walk out the back door and be knocked over the head by a giant comet? So there was a great problem in getting telegrams, admitting telegrams north about the discovery. Initially, in the southern hemisphere, the comet was discovered in the daytime by Wells and several other observers. One Dr. Common in England, observing near the sun, he was able to see the comet through his dense solar filter. The comet was so bright, in fact, that it was observed right up until the time it transited the disk of the sun. A South African observer claimed that he was able to observe the comet and made a comparison, saying that it was the head of the comet appeared as brilliant or as bright as the outer limb of the sun, from which we can infer that the magnitude at its peak was somewhere between -15 and -20. Following perihelion, the comet moved into the morning sky as an immense, brilliant object. The tail was brighter than any normal tail ever observed. And in fact, in one description indicated that about 3 weeks past perihelion, as twilight came on in the morning sky, when all the first magnitude stars were being swamped by the growing light of day, the comet head and 10 degrees of tail remained plainly visible to the unaided eye. This comet continued to move away from the sun and was visible to the naked eye for more than 6 months. And even 3 months after perihelion passage, it was a third magnitude object in the midnight sky with a 15 to 20 degree tail. Truly truly an impressive object. The next comet to come along was in the year 1901, and this was the great comet Vizcara, another comet that was discovered in the southern hemisphere in April of 1901, shortly before it had reached perihelion. It was the first magnitude object, rapidly approaching the sun, and became visible on the 24th of April in full daylight telescopically as an object of -2. After passing perihelion in early May, it was seen as a first magnitude object in the southern evening skies with 2 tails, the longest of which was 30 degrees. The nucleus had also split into 2 pieces, and the 2 pieces were observed to move away from one another over the course of the next few months as the comet remained under observation. Another stupendous comet came to us in the year 1910, but it was not Halley's comet, not yet anyway. It was the great daylight comet of 1910, appearing in January of that year. It was discovered in broad daylight. The comet was seen as a brilliant object, snowy white object, within a degree or two of the sun in the sky, about as bright as the planet Venus. And the comet was so brilliant that it was readily visible to those who looked into the eastern sky toward the rising sun. The comet appeared in early January of 1910, and as it continued to round the sun at perihelion, it came northward, or started to move northward rapidly, and came into view for us here in the northern hemisphere in mid-January, and became a stupendous object in the evening sky for the northern hemisphere for a change. A long sweeping tail stretched out from the comet head to a length of more than 50 degrees. Now here is the announcement of the comet, and this was in the front page of the New York Times on January 18, 1910. And the comet mistakenly was referred to as Innes's comet, and there's a reason for that. In 1910, the first people who saw this comet were miners in South Africa. They were just getting ready to go down into the mine for the day at the crack of dawn. And as they looked over into the eastern sky, they saw the sun rising, and they saw what they perceived to be Halley's Comet right above the sun. So they told the foreman, "Hey, we see Halley's Comet." The foreman said, "Hey, that's great." Picked up the phone, and thinking that he could get a little bit of publicity, called the local newspaper in Johannesburg. The newspaper found it interesting too. And so what they did was, to add on to the story a bit, they decided that they would call the local observatory in South Africa, and they spoke to the head of the observatory, Robert Innes. They said, "Hey, some miners just saw Halley's Comet with the rising sun." Now, Innes, of course, being an astronomer, knew that, number one, Halley's Comet wasn't due for another 2 or 3 more months. Number two, certainly Halley's Comet would never get bright enough to be seen in broad daylight. So he said, "Nah, you didn't see Halley's Comet. You might have seen something else, maybe Venus, but it couldn't possibly be a comet." Well, anyway, curiosity must have gotten the best of Innes, because he was up at the crack of dawn the next morning to see what these people thought was a comet. And I wish I could be a fly on the observatory wall to see his reaction when he looked into the eastern sky, and there, hovering above the sun, plain as day, was a brilliant comet. For the rest of that morning and for the rest of that day, Innes was sending cablegrams to observatories all over the world, telling them to look, we've got a daytime comet. And I guess from that, people thought that Innes was the discoverer of the comet. But again, he wasn't. He was the person who was trying to rebut the story from a bunch of miners in South Africa. But it turned out, again, that it was true. When the comet made its first appearance in New York, as you can see, in some ways like the comet of 1843, when only the tail was visible and nobody knew what they were looking at. Picture this: you're in Manhattan and you're walking along in the streets of New York, and you're looking at the sunset, and then after sunset, you see a big shaft of light stretching up into the sky for 20 or 25 degrees. What is it? And they called. Numerous phone calls came into the New York Times. "Hey, we're seeing something out there. What is it? Is it Halley's Comet? Yeah, or maybe it's an aurora, the aurora borealis." Well, how can it be an aurora? Aurora is in the north. This shaft of light is in the west. But that's how people discovered. Many New Yorkers got their first view, their first sight of the great comet, the great daylight comet of 1910. And get an idea of just how large this comet was in the sky. The comet on this white on black illustration, this is the comet head. The star right next to the comet head is Enough in Pegasus. Here's the great square of Pegasus right here. And here's Enough and the nose of the flying horse. And the comet covered the entire constellation of Pegasus at the time. A wonderful object. When it became visible, and it was visible for more than 3 months to the naked eye. Many people from 1910 who thought they saw Halley's Comet, in fact, probably saw the great daylight comet of 1910, which appeared some 3 months ahead of Halley's Comet. But this is not to say that Halley's Comet was no shirker either. In fact, the 1910 apparition was probably Halley's finest apparition going all the way back to the year 837 AD, when in that year the comet almost collided with the Earth. In 1910, the comet, Halley's Comet, was visible to the naked eye for more than 5 months. As it passed through perihelion, it became very bright, apparently on the order of -1 to -2, and the Earth may have actually passed through the outer edges of its tail. At that time, the tail stretched the greatest distance across the sky of any tail ever recorded. From the southern hemisphere and for suitably placed northern observers, the tail apparently reached a prodigious length of 130 to 140 degrees. Now, here's a building a sketch of a building, and you look at it and you say to yourself, well, that's a nice picture of a building. I don't know what that building is. I have no idea. But yes, you do. You know that. In fact, this is probably a very familiar building to all of you. How familiar? You come across it every year on New Year's Eve, just a few minutes before the stroke of midnight. This is the building where they drop the big ball every year at Times Square. The building, if you look carefully, you could see or make out the word Times. This was the Times Tower. In the early 20th century, the New York Times came from this building. That, in fact, is how that part of New York City became known as Times Square. In later years, other names for this building. In the 1960s and 70s, it was known as the Allied Chemical Building. Today, it's known as Number 1 Times Square. Now, I wouldn't suggest that you go to the top of this building today to do any stargazing. Obviously, you wouldn't see very much. But back in 1910, this was one of the tallest structures, not only in New York, but in the entire world. It was 23 stories high, and 2 stories above that was the observing tower. And it was there that a young lady by the name of Mary Proctor, whose father was a very famous British astronomer in the 19th century, Richard Proctor. Mary Proctor was hired by the New York Times to make daily or nightly observations of Halley's Comet and write about it in the newspaper and tell people what to look for and what it was looking like on a daily basis during the month of May. Interesting, she would arrive at the Times Tower at around 2:30 in the morning, and she would show her past, which was written out by the assistant editor of the New York Times, to the night watchman. The night watchman would then escort her to the lift. Mary Proctor was English, but we know a lift is an elevator. You went to the lift and went all the way up to the 23rd floor, and then she climbed out of the elevator and up a spiral staircase, 2 stories up more, and she was at the top of the building. There's the flagpole where the ball is dropped every year. And from that post, that observation post, she gave daily or nightly narrations of what Halley's Comet looked like. On the morning of May 19th, when the comet and the tail were closest to the Earth, this is the sketch that she made. As you can see, here's the brand new Queensboro Bridge. It was just built the year before, in 1909. And here is the tail of the comet. You can see the Great Square of Pegasus here. 2 of the stars of the Great Square are embedded in the tail. The bright, brilliant planet Venus is here, and higher up is Altair. We saw that earlier with the Great Comet of 1680. And keep in mind that in this particular view that was sketched out by Mary Proctor, that you're looking at only about 1/3 of the tail's full length in the sky. It was an incredible but brief apparition. The next comet to come along took 17 years, and it was the great comet that appeared in 1927, Comet 1927-9, with the fantastic name of Scaglierup-Maristani. Another brilliant comet, but observed under the poorest circumstances possible. The orbital geometry was such that the comet could not be observed in a dark sky at any time from either the northern or the southern hemisphere. But it reached tremendous magnitude at perihelion. It was discovered with the naked eye and was observed during the daytime from several locations, most notably one in Germany. Well, when word got out that a comet that bright was visible in the sky, and since this was only a few days before Christmas, the newspapers, the local news media started speculating. Could this possibly be, they asked, a return of the Star of Bethlehem? And of course, this got New Yorkers very excited, and people were looking. in the morning before the sunrise, in the evening after sunset for the new comet Joerao. But because of its proximity to the sun, and because it was so low in the sky and difficult to see, as you can see here from this story in the New York Times, New York City watched in vain for this brilliant comet. It was a little bit of a disappointment, but now I have a question. How do you really compare an object that is visible in the daytime against nothing? The only planet you would have available to make a comparison with would be Venus, -4 or 4.5, and then you have to extrapolate. And yet the comet presumably is located near the sun against a bright background. Go out tomorrow afternoon and look at the sun around midday and just conceive of how bright an object you would have to have in order to be visible within just a few degrees of the sun in the sky. Incredibly brilliant, probably much brighter than the estimates indicate. Unfortunately, I only had one image of that great comet of 1927, but the next one that came along in 1948 was a wonderful object, illustrated widely, photographed widely. But it was the discovery that was quite unique, for it was first seen at totality during a total solar eclipse on November the 1st, 1948. Quite unexpectedly, as the sun became completely covered by the disk of the moon, there appeared a comet only 2 degrees from the sun that was brighter than the planet Venus and had a 5-degree tail. I would have imagined that even the stodgy professionals oohed and ahed at the sight on this occasion. As the comet pulled away from the sun, the comet moved out into the early evening sky, in the morning sky, I should say, and was still as bright as -2 or -3, as seen from the southern hemisphere. It threw out a long, straight tail, some 15 to 20 degrees in length as it moved out into the morning sky. Unfortunately, the comet's declination in the sky was such that it could not be well observed for us here in the northern hemisphere. So again, we lost out. But the next comet to come along was one that actually favored the northern hemisphere. And this particular comet was Comet Arend-Rauland, which appeared in the year 1957. As it rounded the sun in April of 1957, it briefly attained a magnitude of 0, about as bright as the star Capella. As it moved back out into the evening sky, well placed in the northwest after twilight had ended, the tail extended for 30 degrees, and an extraordinary appendage extended sunward from the head of the comet. And that appendage was this, an anti-tail that was visible to the unaided eye, one of the rarest of all cometary phenomena, and it stretched for 15 degrees. So under a dark sky, with binoculars, considering the anti-tail with the normal tail, the object could be traced for a total of 45 degrees in length in the warm spring skies of those long ago nights. A mere 5 years later came a comet called Secchi-Lines, and Secchi-Lines is the great comet that almost nobody remembers. As it approached the sun, it was visible mainly from the southern hemisphere. The comet brightened dramatically as it neared the sun, and when it was last observed in the evening twilight, it already attained a brightness greater than the planet Mercury, or on the order of -2. On April the 1st, April Fool's Day, the comet rounded perihelion and passed to within 2.5 million miles of the sun. Predictions were that it should attain a magnitude of -7, yet there were no confirming observations of that fact. However, just a few days later, it was spotted in the evening sky, coming back out from the sun, already but still an object of -2.5 with a beautifully curving 15-degree tail. Unfortunately, the comet was receding rapidly from the Earth and the sun, and the image that you see here diminished very, very quickly, and it was all gone in a matter of just 5 or 6 weeks. Scant 3 years after that great comet, we had Comet Ikeya-Secchi, 1965. The brightest comet of the 20th century. It approached the sun and reached perihelion around October the 21st. On October 20th and 21st, as you see here, this is the sun in both of these images. The 21st was here and the 20th is here, and it was visible within just a degree or two of the sun in the sky. it was seen by hundreds of observers all over the world in the daytime, and the brightness then was estimated to be somewhere between -6 to -8. However, the comet was not going to be reaching perihelion for yet a few more hours, and then it was going to be visible from Japan, the homeland of the observers who discovered it. And as it came to perihelion, many estimates indicated that it reached -15. As it pulled away from the sun now in full retreat, it appeared in our morning sky. But we here in New York were unable to see it. And now I must tell you, comets were thought to be evil omens. They were considered to be the finger of a god pointing toward man and warning him of famine, flood, epidemic, or some other disaster. Dis aster means bad star. Dis means against, aster means star. So from an astrological point of view, comets were disasters. They were stars that were against you. And yet, for me, this comet, Comet Akeyaseki, played a major role in my life, a very special place in my life that I'd like to tell you about right now. To deviate for a few minutes off of the subject of comets, and want to tell you how this comet, again, played a role in, I guess, my career as a science reporter, a meteorologist, an astronomer. As you could see in this article from the New York Times, putting on Comet Akeyaseki was a spectacular display for most of the world, but not here in the eastern United States, because we had an atmospheric inversion. In other words, what happened was that all of the pollutants that we put up into the atmosphere during the day, there was no wind at all. And so all of those pollutants would go up into space, and then during the overnight hours, they would settle down and create what I guess the best way to describe it would be a layer of schmutz. You couldn't see anything during the overnight hours. During the day, as a little bit of wind blew, that dispersed the schmutz enough so that you were able to see the sun hazily burn through the clouds in the afternoon. But once it got dark again and it cooled off, boom, back came the schmutz. This was aggravating, I'm sure, to astronomers, people who wanted to see this brilliant comet, unable to see it, not just in New York, but across much of the eastern seaboard because of this stagnant weather pattern. One astronomer was not going to be denied, and that was Ken Franklin. Ken Franklin was an astronomer and the assistant chairman, this is 1965, at the Hayden Planetarium in New York. He was a master scientist. He was the first man to discover and detect radio emissions from the planet Jupiter back in the 1950s. And then he landed at the Hayden Planetarium, where he was for a number of years thereafter. As Dr. Isaac Asimov described him, he was short, he was plump, curly-haired, and quizzical. He was a straight-faced jokester. But Ken wanted to see the comet, and so he got hold of a friend of his who was a pilot. Together they went to Teterboro Airport, and the pilot had a plane, a Cessna. They flew in the Cessna to an altitude of 12,000 feet above West Point. And this image that you see here is a painting that was rendered by the planetarium artist, Helmut K. Wimmer. After Ken returned to the planetarium that day, he spoke with Helmut K. Wimmer and described what he saw. And then Helmut painted this view of what Dr. Franklin saw. Here you see the schmutz layer down here. Just above the schmutz layer is a thick layer of haze, which dramatically attenuated or diminished the light of the sun. And above and to the right of the sun, shining like a brilliant, tiny arrowhead in the sky, was Comet Akeyaseki, a daylight comet. And Dr. Franklin got a chance to see it. And in fact, it appears that he was the only person in the eastern part of the country, because of the lousy weather, to see the daylight comet. Made headlines nationally as well as locally. And this caught the attention of a person who was very well known to us kids. I was only 9 years old at the time, but it caught the attention of this man. Maybe now that you look at him, the face may be familiar. This man's name was Sonny Fox. Sonny Fox was the host of Wonderama, the 4-hour marathon kid show. And many of you here might have grown up on Wonderama with another guy, Bob McAllister. Bob McAllister took over Wonderama in 1968. But before 1968, from 1959 to 1967, the host was Sonny Fox. Bob McAllister, when he was the host of Wonderama, he played it out as a kiddie show. You know, he sang songs, they played some games, they showed cartoons. Sonny was a little bit different. Sonny's version of Wonderama was a mixture of slapstick, serious content, with that 4-hour Sunday marathon, including Shakespearean dramatizations, newsmakers, political people such as Mayor John Lindsay, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, sports figures like Willie Mays. They would come on the show and they would chat for a while with Sonny Fox on Wonderama. There was magic demonstrations by the magician, the amazing Randy. There were art instructions, spelling bees, Simon Says, learning games, and other elements. Sonny, in short, felt that the kids, while they should be entertained, should also learn something. And so when Dr. Franklin saw the comet, he said to himself, there's the guy we ought to have on Wonderama this Sunday. And sure enough, that Sunday, here was Dr. Franklin sitting down with Sonny Fox talking about the comet and talking about astronomy and talking about a whole bunch of things. Can you imagine an astronomer today, a high-profile astronomer, spending time with a bunch of 9, 10, 11-year-old kids and talking and answering their questions about astronomy? And then came a point where Sonny said, well, Dr. Franklin, now that the comet Kawasaki has moved out into space, I guess we've lost our chance to see it. And Dr. Franklin, in that long John Silver voice that he had, said, oh, no, quite the contrary. In fact, over the next couple of weeks, the comet should be very bright and very prominent in our morning sky, if we only had some good, clear weather for us to see it, which was the problem. We had that schmutz and that haze still in the New York City metropolitan area. But then, and actually what he did after they came out of a commercial break, he was standing in front of a blackboard, and Dr. Franklin was drawing on the blackboard how you could see the comet, what part of the sky to look for, and what times you should get up to see it. And here I am. I was 9 years old in the 4th grade, and I'm sitting there with my, with a pad and pencil, taking everything down, about how I'm going to see it, like that, because my interest in astronomy was just really starting to rev up right about that time in the hobby. Well, then it finally happened. We had a sharp cold front move through, and with it came a completely different weather pattern. Beginning a few days before Halloween and continuing for about the next week, we had a spate of very clear, cold mornings. You could see stars all the way down to the horizon. And these were the mornings when we here in New York were finally able to see Comet Kawasaki. As it pulled away from the sun, now in full retreat, during those mornings when we here in New York were finally able to see the comet in the morning sky, and if you look here on this wide-angle photograph, you might recognize Leo the lion with the backwards question mark here and the triangle marking the hindquarters. Here's Bernice's hare, Coma Berenices here. Here's Alphard, the lonely star, marking the heart of the sea serpent, Hydra, and down near the horizon, with the tail stretching up for about 25 degrees, there was the comet. And I woke up one morning, a couple of hours before sunrise, stepped outside, and I could see the tail of the Kawasaki extending almost vertically above the horizon, looking like some luminous airplane contrail in the sky. You couldn't miss it. You could see it clearly with the naked eye. And a few days earlier, when I was talking about this at the dinner table with my grandmother and my grandfather, I said, you want me to wake you up if we see the comet, if I catch sight of it? And my grandmother, like half-heartedly, she wasn't thinking. She said, yeah, you wake us up if you see it, Joseph. You wake us up. Well, I came running back into the house, banging on my grandparents' door. Hey, Nanny, Peepa, wake up, wake up. You got to come out and see the comet. Of course, the first reaction was, what did he say? What are you talking about, Joseph? But they came out, and it was fantastic. Using my grandfather's binoculars, I could trace the comet over its entire 25-degree length. And a little later, as the tail rose higher, the comet's head came above the horizon, and without binoculars, I couldn't see the detail in the head at all, but with binoculars, the head of the comet, very low to the horizon, I could see clearly the tiny star-like coma of the comet. The head faded very rapidly in the days to come, but the tail continued for more than 6 weeks to dominate the morning sky. I was so happy. I got up like 4 or 5 mornings in a row to see this amazing sight. And I was so happy that I finally decided I was going to write a letter of thanks to Dr. Franklin at the Planetarium. And so one day I sat down and I wrote on loose leaf paper to Dr. Franklin. And I said, I saw you on Wonderama and you told us how to look for the comet. And I got up and I saw the comet, and I drew a sketch of how the comet looked like to me from my home. I was living in Throgs Neck in the Bronx at that time. I drew the sketch. I didn't know how quite to end the letter, sincerely yours or very truly yours. So I ended the letter by saying, someday I'd like to have a chance to meet you. Someday I'd like to have a chance to shake your hand or be able to say hello to you. Put the letter in the envelope, mailed it out to the Hayden Planetarium, almost forgot about it. I just figured it would be a nice little thing to do, to thank the guy who told me about it. A week later, my grandmother meets me at the
life doesn't go on.
Okay.
Something happened.
Okay, so it's obviously not plugged in. Did you check to make sure it was plugged in?
Well, see, here it is.
Here was the letter that Dr. Franklin wrote to me, thanking me about it, happy that his appearance on Wonderama gave me a chance to see the comet, and he told me the tail was 35 million miles in length. And then the final paragraph, I'd like to meet you too and chat about your interest in astronomy. Call me at TR31, extension 323. Speak with my secretary, Miss Oliver, who I would later in my life get to know personally as Fran.
It's all in.
And
your
we'll make
laptop's
arrangements to
on.
get together. And some days later, we did. On a Friday afternoon at about 3:30 in the afternoon, my grandfather drove me down, and together we sat in Dr. Franklin's office. And Dr. Franklin spent 45 minutes just chatting with me, a 9-year-old kid, about astronomy and the stars and the sky. What do you want to do when you
symphony?
grow up? What do you want to be? It was amazing. And then after the chat was over, Francine Oliver came in with a swag bag of little tchotchkes from the Hayden Planetarium, little souvenirs from the Planetarium.
I understand.
It was great. It was wonderful.
Would someone please mute their microphone?
Spend 45 minutes chatting with a 9-year-old kid, but that was Dr. Franklin. That was the kind of person he was.
Got me.
2 years later, I started getting Sky and Telescope. I started subscribing to Sky and Telescope when I was 11 years old. And much to the chagrin of my wife, who's sitting in the audience in front of me, much to the chagrin of my wife, I have every single magazine issue since 1967. I have them in sleeves, and they're right outside my home office where I live now in Putnam Valley. And they're great. They're part of my astronomical library. But I started in 1967 getting Sky and Tel. And back in those days, before social media, Sky and Telescope would ask you if you saw something in the sky, an eclipse, a comet, a meteor shower, a conjunction, write to us. Tell us your observation. And they would print observations in the magazine, pictures and thoughts about what people saw. On Good Friday in 1968, we had a total eclipse of the moon. The moon was right next to the bright star Spica. Here's this red ball next to a almost diamond-like bluish-white star in the sky. And of course, following the instructions, I wrote and sent my observations in. I was watching it with my 2.4-inch Tasco. I later ended up calling it my fiasco telescope. But I sent my observation in. But I was the only one, of course, who saw that. It was clear across much of the United States that night. And there was something like 300 people who wrote. And so they printed the best photographs. They printed the most interesting observations. But for all the others, they would print the name and the address of the people who wrote. And there you see all of the people who wrote in and sent their observation. And yours truly, right here, there he is, Joerao, Bronx. Now, I have been published in many different journals and magazines ever since. But I have to tell you, I have never been more thrilled than to see that Joerao, Bronx, New York, in Sky and Telescope in the June issue than I was when that magazine arrived in my mailbox. And by the way, take a look all the way up at the top here, and you see another name of interest. And there is Al Nagler. Yeah. I was only 11 years old. Al Nagler was in his early 30s. And so, yeah, there we were together all those many years ago, myself and Al, and so many others who had seen that eclipse. And the interesting thing is, every time I made an observation, I'd send it to Sky and Tel, and I would send it to Dr. Franklin. So all of my observations through the years went to the magazine and also went to Dr. Franklin. He didn't mail me back any letters, but I knew he was reading them because I think it was in the mid or late 70s, Channel 2 did a story on the Perseid meteor shower. And in that story, the reporter asked Dr. Franklin about the meteors. Dr. Franklin said, well, the best place you could go is out in the country where it's nice and dark. You see a lot of meteors. But then the reporter said, well, what about, Dr. Franklin, those of us who are stuck in the city? Is anybody going to be able to see any of this if they're stuck in New York? And Dr. Franklin said, oh, absolutely. In fact, I have it on authority from a very reliable observer in the Bronx that he has been seeing bright meteors from the Perseid shower. And I was watching this. I said, that's me. That's me. He's reading. And so I knew he was looking at all of these observations and everything. And then in 1983, I had a chance to write an article for the 10th anniversary edition of Astronomy magazine about Comet Swift-Tuttle and the Perseid meteor shower. And before I sent the article in, I wrote to Dr. Franklin and said, would you look at this article? Could you look at it and make any corrections or comments about it? Oh, and by the way, I mentioned you in the article. That's one way of getting somebody to look at the article, right? And sure enough, so he looked at it, thought it was very good, sent me back some corrections, and said, I think this is a very fine article. I think you'll get published, and I did, and it was great. It was wonderful. 1983, the same year that my article was published in Astronomy, Dr. Franklin started something new. He started a weekly column in the Sunday New York Times of a map of the sky and a dissertation about what you're going to be able to see in the nighttime sky for that upcoming week. The name of the column was called Skywatch, and Dr. Franklin wrote that article, that column, every single Sunday from 1983 till the end of 1997. In 1986, I was fortunate to get on the staff of the Hayden Planetarium as an instructor, as an associate and a guest lecturer. And that was like a dream come true, being able to play with the Zeiss 6 projector that I had grown up on. And now I had a chance to actually sit behind the console and move that 2.5-ton machine all around and being able to talk to people and give sky shows. That was a great thing for me. In 1997, in his mid-70s now, Dr. Franklin made it clear to Dr. Tyson, who is now the director of the planetarium, that he didn't want to do the column in the New York Times anymore, that he needed the time more than the money. And Dr. Tyson read this. He said, well, I don't want to do it. I've got a lot on my plate. I can't be bothered writing a weekly column in the New York Times. I don't know when I would be able to write it. And that's when Dr. Franklin said, well, how about Joerao? What do you think about that? I think Joe would be excellent to write that column in the New York Times. And so upon that suggestion, Dr. Tyson wrote this letter to the editor of the Science New York Times. And he gave me a recommendation, a very nice recommendation, that once Dr. Franklin gave up the Skywatch column at the end of 1997, let Joerao do it. Joerao knows a lot about the nighttime sky. He's very impressive to me as his knowledge of the sky. So, in 1998, I started doing the New York Times column, the Skywatch column, and it was great. I must tell you that when you become a columnist for the New York Times, albeit once a week, it opens doors for you. With that column, I ended up also being offered the position of writing a column in space.com, writing a monthly column in Natural History magazine. I also was asked by Sky and Telescope to be a contributing editor. All of these things, again, happening, I would presume, because I had now started editing or writing the Skywatch column in the Sunday New York Times. That lasted for another 15 years. And then in 2013, some bean counter at the Times, looking for a way to save money, I guess, decided that it was time to end the column after 30 years, 15 for Franklin and 15 for me. And I got very upset about that, as you would well aware. And I'm also will tell you, a lot of people, a lot of readers got upset. I got emails from people I never heard from who said the only reason why they bought the Sunday Times was to get that column and to read the column and look at the star map. And again, I was very upset. And the one email that was short, sweet, to the point, was written to me by a very dear friend who sadly we passed away just a couple of months ago. Maybe some of you knew him, Dennis Cassia. He was originally out of Thornwood, New York. He was a firefighter in Connecticut, and also a very assiduous amateur astronomer. And he wrote to me an email that said, "The Times did a nice job with their statement. Did you ever imagine 40 years ago that you and the great Kenneth Franklin would be referenced in the same paragraph?" All of this coming from writing a letter to Dr. Franklin in the 4th grade. That's how it really all began. A postscript. Sonny Fox, in 2012, he appeared at the Paley Center in Manhattan as part of a program called The Pioneers of Early Television. And Sonny appeared there. And when I found out about that, I knew I had to be down there to meet with him, to see him, to tell him about how he helped in my relationship with Dr. Franklin. In his autobiography, Sonny Fox wrote that once on Wonderama, he was unable to do a commercial for Juju Beads. Remember Juju Beads, the candy, right? For some reason, it struck him as very funny. And he just kept laughing and laughing and laughing. And finally, after 10 minutes, he just said, "Just buy Juju Beads, will you?" He couldn't do the commercial. So when I came down to see him and shake hands with him and tell him about, my life and Dr. Franklin, I was there to present him with a box of Juju Beads. Sonny was sharp as a tack. He was at that time, I believe he was 83 years old. He passed away of COVID in 2020 at the age of 95. My final thought: the world would be a lot better today if we had more Ken Franklins and Sonny Foxes. Back to comets. 1970 brought us Bennett's Comet. And I hope that a few of you might remember that. It was a wonderful object, the finest comet for the Northern Hemisphere skies since the Daylight Comet of 1910, found by South African amateur astronomer Jack Bennett in the far southern sky well before perihelion. Late February, already an impressive object from the southern latitudes, and on entering the twilight, southern observers rated it at first magnitude with a 15 to 20 degree tail. It appeared suddenly and dramatically in late March for the Northern Hemisphere in the eastern morning sky. Elongation considerable. It remained in the dark sky for more than an hour before twilight began. Magnitude reached 0 to -1. Its tail could be traced for 25 to 30 degrees. Telescopically, within the head of the comet, extraordinary structures were visible. Pinwheels of gas ripped off the nucleus, extended back through the tail like some cosmic fireworks. For several days, the comet was visible almost to the point of daylight. Many observers indicate that it was visible within a few minutes of sunrise itself. In 1976, Comet West appeared, the third great comet in just a 9-year span. As it approached perihelion, this was the discovery, just a dim object in September of 1975, but as it approached perihelion, the comet brightened very rapidly, reaching a magnitude of -1 to -2, as reported by Colorado observer Richard Keene. On the day of perihelion, February 25th, 1976, the comet was observed by Stephen O'Meara, Peter Collins, and John Bortle in broad daylight telescopically, and toward sunset, Bortle was able to catch the comet with the naked eye in daylight. During the next few days, the comet emerged into the morning sky as an object of -1 with a huge and complex tail. And excitement built as the comet started getting brighter and brighter, rounded the sun. It was exceeding all forecasts, and we were beginning to realize that we were going to have a spectacular object in the morning sky come the beginning of March. A friend of mine, Glenn Schneider, and I, and a couple of others, we traveled up to Jeffersonville in Sullivan County, New York, for a dark sky, for a chance to see this brilliant comet. And on the morning that we woke up and headed out to the location where we were going to observe it, we were met by this. And we were quite frankly, we were pissed off. But just as we were packing everything back up into the car and getting ready to head back to the hotel that we were staying at, all of a sudden, a rift developed in the cloud cover, kind of like a break, and almost like a curtain, the clouds parted this way. And as they did, it revealed to us this incredible, this amazing sight of Comet West with a tail so complex that in binoculars, it showed 5 separate components, the most since any comet since 1744. And not to be outdone by any other comet, the head also fractured, and as many as 4 nuclei were visible in the head of the comet, slowly separating as it moved away from the sun. The comet remained visible to the naked eye until late April of the year 1976. Well, 19 years later, in November of 1975, Sky and Telescope magazine asked this question: could this become the next great comet? This comet, of course, Comet Hale-Bopp, was visible far, far from the sun, out beyond the orbit of Jupiter, but visible in binoculars. You didn't need a big telescope. You didn't need a 24-inch to see it. A pair of binoculars at that distance showed this comet. And there was talk that this could become a truly great comet, a brilliant comet. At the time, I had a newsletter that I was distributing to about 200 or 300 people, and I was thinking about running off a lot more to try to get more people to subscribe to it. But I was worried, will this become another Comet Kohoutek? Would this become another Comet Austin, or one of those comets that fell flat on its face? So I called Dr. Brian Marsden at the Central Bureau for Astronomical Telegrams, who did all the orbital calculations, all the brightness for comets. He was the one who suggested that it would be a very bright object in the spring of 1997. And I said to Dr. Marsden, I said, you know, Dr. Marsden, maybe we should pull back a little bit on the reins here. You know, we haven't had a really spectacular comet in a long time. And he was from England. He dressed me down like a British headmaster at school. He said, Joe, they're all great comets, and there's no reason that this one will not be. And the reason that he had such confidence in Hale-Bopp was because it had been around the block a few times. Comets that come from the Oort cloud, comets that are new, virgin comets that are making their first trip to the sun, usually have a volatile layer of material on it that starts burning off far from the sun and makes it look very bright. Once it gets near to the sun, all that material is gone, and the comet reveals itself to be just a little lump. And that's what happened with Kohoutek. That's what happened with Comet Austin. I was concerned that that was the case, but Dr. Marsden said, those comets, they fizzle out. This comet has been here before. This comet was here 4,000 years ago, about the time when they were building the Great Pyramids, and has been around probably many other times since. This comet will not fail us. This will become a great comet. Well, we still had about 18 months before the comet was going to reach perihelion. Oh, darn it, I can't wait. I can't wait for the spring of night. And then, just like 1910, when the world was waiting for Halley's Comet, and suddenly a new comet suddenly appeared out of nowhere ahead of Halley's Comet, look what happened. In the spring of 1996, we had Hyakutake, and it was discovered by Yuji Hyakutake. This comet was not exceptionally large, it was not exceptionally bright intrinsically, but it passed only 9 million miles from the Earth. And as a result, the comet became quite bright. In fact, so bright, it reached -1 in brightness. And here's a view that, and this pretty much sums it all up. This was the view that I had with Sam Storch, the gentleman who will be giving the talk virtually next month to the WAA. This is what Comet Hyakutake looked like at perigee when it was closest to the Earth, 9 million miles away. A very large, bright head and a long tail. Here's the bowl of the Big Dipper. You can see right here, the bowl and the handle. There's Mizar. Here's the bowl of the Little Dipper right there. And here is the comet on the night when it was closest to the Earth. And I was able to see from Hopewell Junction. That's where we parked our car. We parked in a nearby residential area in Hopewell Junction, got out. Sam had his Fujidan binoculars, and I had my Nickermac camera. You remember cameras, right? And this is the view we had of it. I traced the tail out for 40 degrees. And people in the western US, where the skies are darker and the air clearer, some said they saw the comet tail stretched as long as 80 and 90 and even close to 100 degrees. So dark skies, the best places to be, I guess, is out in the western US. But it was a glorious sight, beautiful. Comet mania indeed. Hyakutake was a hit. And then, after Hyakutake moved on by, our attention turned to Hale-Bopp, which I called the photo-op comet. There you see a view of Hale-Bopp over Stonehenge. Here's a view of Hale-Bopp over the Grand Tetons. Here's a view of Hale-Bopp over the Great Pyramids. Hale-Bopp was a beautiful comet and showed two distinct tails, a dust tail of yellow, the dusty material that reflects light very easily and makes the tail look so bright, and a gas tail, an ion tail, a bluish tail, which stretched out in the same direction, but split off like a fork in the sky. It was a beautiful, beautiful comet, a spring spectacle, and like Hyakutake the year before, Hale-Bopp was a winner. Since Hale-Bopp, in 1997, we have had three other bright comets. We've had, in January of 2007, Comet McDaught. In December of 2010, another Kreutz sungrazer, Comet Lovejoy. And just this year, in January, we had Comet Atlas. And you look at those three and you say, well, wait a minute, Joe. I don't remember any of those comets. How could I possibly have missed that? You missed them because all three of those comets were visible chiefly and primarily from south of the equator, from the southern hemisphere. These were spectacles that the southern hemisphere could enjoy, but we here in the northern hemisphere could not, unfortunately, because of their declination south. While the law of averages says that great comets appear an average of once every 20 to 25 years, over the last 50 years, we have had no fewer than 6 such dazzlers, an average of about one great comet per decade. A veritable proliferation of great comets, but unfortunately 3 of those 6, as you see on the screen here, visible primarily from the southern hemisphere. For those of us living in mid-northern latitudes, we haven't had a truly great comet view since Hale-Bopp, and that, believe it or not, was 28 years ago. Some of you probably remember Comet Neowise back in 2020, or Tushanan Atlas, which appeared just 1 year ago in our western evening sky after sunset. And you may have thought that those were great comets. But no, while both were nice, they were not great comets. They fell far short of being branded great comets. In short, if you don't remember Hale-Bopp or Hyakutake, you haven't seen anything yet, believe me. And if you've ever given a chance to see another great comet in the foreseeable future, I strongly advise you to try and get to a location that is not light polluted. I'm afraid that those of us who stay within the boundaries of the tri-state metropolitan area are not going to see a great comet in all of its splendor. In fact, you probably will have to travel some considerable distance because, as you can see here, the umbrella of light pollution is very serious over much of the northeastern United States. But if the opportunity does come, be sure not to miss it, because as we have just seen in this past hour, great comets are rare and wonderful objects to behold. Now, I always like to end my presentations with a commentary from this gentleman. Astronomy is the oldest of the sciences, and therefore, amateur astronomy may rightfully claim to be the oldest of the scientific hobbies. And I always like to end my astronomy presentations with the words of an amateur astronomer by the name of Garrett P. Service. Service earned a law degree at Columbia University, but he never became an attorney. Instead, he joined the New York Sun in 1879 and later became a renowned popularizer of astronomy. And in 1910, Service wrote these words: "Surely there is not another field of human contemplation so wonderfully rich as astronomy. It is so easy to reach, so responsive to every mood, so stimulating, so uplifting, so abstracting, and immensely consoling. Now, everybody may not be a chemist. Everybody may not be a geologist. Everybody may not be a mathematician. But everybody may be and ought to be, in a modest and personal way, an astronomer. For stargazing is a great medicine for the soul." Thank you very much. Can I give a couple questions? Yeah, sure. That's all, folks. Anybody have any questions? I'll be very happy to answer them as best I can. What oh, about the comet, like Comet Lemon?
Yeah.
And well, those are certainly not Comet Lemon, and the other two comets that have been around this past month, Comet Swan and Comet Atlas, who everybody is saying is being followed by a flying saucer. These are by far and away not great comets at all. In fact, these comets are barely visible. You know, the funny thing is, in this society that we live in, there are numerous websites on social media that have written some stories about these comets, making them sound like the be-all or end-all of comets. Let me tell you that is nothing more than clickbait, because a lot of these places on the internet survive by the number of people who come to their sites, their websites. If nobody comes to the website, then it's not any use to run the site, and they shut down. And unfortunately, in the case of these three comets, even in the case of Comet Lemon, if you were to show it to the average person, it wouldn't really give you any kind of major reaction. I remember in 1986, I was at Jones Beach, and I was showing Halley's Comet through my telescope, and there were long lines of people waiting to get a view through my telescope of Halley's Comet. Now, this is a historic object, right? And people were waiting and willing to stay a long time to see it. And one woman, I never forget it, came up, looked at it through my 10-inch Dobsonian. Then she looked at me and she said, "It looks like a smur." And I said, "A smur? What's a smur?" And she said, "That's a cross between a smudge and a blur." And as she walked away, now at that time, Halley was about 4th magnitude, about the same brightness as Lemon was a little while ago. She's walking away from the telescope, and as she's walking away, she says, "I can't believe I stood online for 20 minutes to see that." That basically is how the general public would react to these three comets that have been visible over the past month. And you know, they say, "Oh my God, oh, the Atlas, and the Comet Lemon was a beautiful thing." But again, not great comets. As I said, on any given night, you could probably see 6 or 7 comets if you watch from sunrise to sunset. Faint, diffuse objects. We're still waiting for that kind of comet that's going to appear in our sky, where step outside and I say, "Look," and "Oh my God, look at that." That is a great comet in anybody's language. Still waiting. 28 years up here in the Northern Hemisphere. Maybe our time is going to come soon, but that is what a great comet is. And as you saw, some of these comets tail stretching over 100 degrees across the sky, brightnesses ranging anywhere from -5 to -15, ridiculous. And that's why when I said to Dr. Morrison, I said, maybe we should pull back a little bit because, great comets. He said, and he was absolutely right, there are great comets. Well, there are. Somewhere out there right now, as I speak to you, there is a great, spectacular comet coming our way. Maybe next year, maybe in 10 years. I don't know, but it's out there, it's coming. And when it comes, you'll know about it. You'll see it. It should be spectacular. Yeah.
So that was my question, Joe. Which is the next one coming up that you think we have may have some luck with? Any predictions?
No, because as David Levy once wrote, comets are like cats, and no matter what you think they're going to do, they do whatever the heck they want. So, yeah.
That you spoke about, the ones from hundreds and hundreds of years ago, can come back again.
Yes, the great comets that belong to the Kreutz sun-grazing family all have periods of roughly 800 years. So the great comet of 1843, that should be coming back to our vicinity around the year 2483. So if you take good care of yourself, but you know what? As I said, the Kreutz family is a family of comets. Back in around 1100 AD, there apparently was a gigantic comet. The 1843 comet might have been that comet that broke into many pieces. And now all of those comets are flying around in the same orbit. And as I said, in 2010, we had Comet Lovejoy, which was a member of that sun-grazing family. Another one from that family, it's like staying at a train station and you're waiting. You're looking for the headlight for the next comet, the next great sun-grazer to come. And when it comes down that track, when we're able to identify it as a great sun-grazer, then we'll know that we have another great comet coming our way. But right now, it's just a matter of waiting for one of those to come. Yeah.
Was it that people started imaging comets?
Excuse me, say that again?
How long ago was it that people started taking pictures of comets?
Well, the first pictures, the first photographs were taken, the great comet of 1882. When I spoke of that, you may have seen one picture with the silhouette of some nearby buildings. That was a photograph. That comet was so bright that even with the very slow photographic plates at that time in 1882, it was so bright that they were able to take photographs, a photograph of that comet. And of course, in 1910, we had photographs of Halley's comet, also the great comet, the great daylight comet of 1910. So probably in the late 19th century, we started taking photographs of comets. And now, of course, today, all you have to do if you get a bright enough comet, or if you get a bright enough display of the northern lights, just pull out that phone and hold it up, and you'll get a view or get a picture.
Oh, your sister sent a text. Great talk, bro. This is your sis. How come you didn't wake me up for Comet Innes?
My sister was 4 years old, I think, at that time, 4 or 5 years old. Would she have remembered it? I don't know. But I will tell you this, and if she's watching right now, she will verify this. In 1970, there was a partial eclipse of the moon. 5% of the moon was covered in the moon shadow, in the Earth's shadow. 5%, looked like a little clip on the man in the moon's chin. And it happened at 3:30 in the morning. I woke her up for that. I woke her up. I called her out of her room, and I was observing with a telescope from my room. It was frigid outside, so I watched from the window in my room. And she lazily, she goes up to the telescope and she looked and she said, "Oh, nice." And then she walked back to her room, and she remembers that. So I didn't wake her up for the comet, but I did wake her up for that eclipse. And I still kid her every once in a while about, the exceedingly underwhelming partial lunar eclipse that she watched. Let's see, at that time, 1970, she was about 11 years old. And she wasn't dumbfounded by that. But she has been to total eclipses with me, most recently in 2024. Yeah.
Alien
almost hit Europe?
In 837 AD.
What would happen?
What, in 830, what would happen? What would have happened?
Yes, what would happen? Kind of a, medium-sized comet.
I wouldn't want to be here for that.
Yeah.
You saw what happened when a relatively small comet, Shoemaker-Levy, hit Jupiter. I remember before the collision, there was actually a bunch of small comets, and I said, Jupiter will swallow it up. It's not going to be any the worse for wear. And then the next night after the collision, it looked like Jupiter had two giant black eyes. You remember that in 1994? And I said, holy mackerel. So if that had happened here on the Earth, I don't think many of us would still be here if that were to happen. And yes, back in the 800s, 878, Halley's Comet came within like 3 million miles of the Earth, and must have been, you thought it was spectacular in 1910. It must have been incredible in 837 AD, when it came very, very close to the Earth during that apparition. Well, I don't want to waste any more of your time, but I thank you very, very much. Thank you.